Hi, this is John Roco, and welcome back to Roco's Modern Life. It's been a long time, and the issue that I'd like to talk about for this season brings back to the Senkaku Diaoyutai dispute. Many of you know that I've talked about it before. Basically what we have are a set of islands, and these islands were in dispute since the late 1800s, the 1890s, that type of situation. Prior to that, they were islands that the Chinese had called the Diaoyutai. It's basically a fishing platform when China would visit Okinawa, which was at that time a different kingdom. So the Chinese had used them as kind of a navigational islands, and fishermen from China for eons have used them, as well as poets talking about these islands. So they were the Diaoyutais for a long, long time. Around the 1860s or so, around that time, Japan tried to consider whose islands are these Diaoyutais, which is what China called them. So whose are they? And at that time, Japan started sending surveyors there. And then what happened eventually later on, in the later part of the 19th century, 1890s, of course, you had the Sino-Chinese War, the Sino-Japanese War. And what happened was that Japan won that war, and during the course of that war, when it became apparent that Japan was winning that war, Japan laid claim to those islands, and at a certain point in the early 1900s, Japan named these islands the Senkakus, which for eons in China had been called the Diaoyutai, so now you have Japan calling these the Senkakus. So they're either the Diaoyutais or the Senkakus, depending on if you're reading from China or Japan. Then, of course, World War II happened, and eventually, of course, we know the course of history happened in World War II and the result of that, ending, of course, with atomic bombs and the unconditional surrender of Japan. And MacArthur going over there and essentially, in many ways, writing the Constitution of Japan and dictating a lot of things that would go over the course of history. Now, there was a peace treaty of San Francisco, and essentially what that peace treaty said in the 1950s was that all islands, all lands stolen from China would go back to China from Japan, that type of thing. And the Okinawa as well as the Senkakus stayed in U.S. control from that time for eons, from the end of World War II until the 1970s. And then we go over to the Nixon administration. And during the Nixon administration with Henry Kissinger, who's still around, as the Secretary of Defense, the Nixon administration was trying to figure out what to do. And this is interesting because now we can read some of those articles. They've been declassified, that type of thing. And certain scholars have tried to figure out, what happened with in the 1970s with Nixon and Kissinger trying to do a situation that would, of course, benefit their area. And what the Nixon administration essentially did was they reverted Okinawa back to Japan, but with that, they also reverted the Senkakus or Diaoyutais, from whatever perspective you have. They reverted those also back to Japan, which set off protests. Protests happened in Taiwan, protests happened in China, even Hong Kong protesters. So from 1971, all these protests happened. Now, prior to that, just in the late 1960s, large storages of natural gas reserves were found there at the Senkakus. So it's quite valuable now. It's not just a fishing platform for fishermen, from eons before going and fishing there. It's now something that's quite valuable. And so from 1971, from that Okinawan Reversion Treaty until current day, so you're talking 71, 81, 91, 2001, 2011, 12, 13, you're talking, the good part of more than 40 years. For more than 40 years, there have been protests happening over what happened in 1971 with the Okinawan Reversion Treaty. And of course, right now we're seeing some of the results of this protest. About a year ago, something like that, you've seen different Chinese fishing boats being in conflict with Japanese Coast Guard. You see a situation with Japanese lawmakers deciding that we'll station soldiers there. And you've seen just protesters from China traveling there and trying to plant a flag there. You've seen protesters from Japan doing the same thing. You've seen all these different type of protests. And generally, you know, from the United States perspective, a lot of people just wondering what is going on there. There really is a lot of history as to what's going on. Now, one of the most significant things that happened recently was over the past couple of years, what happened was that there was an official in Japan, and you have to realize what happens here, because this is a very nationalistic type of situation for Japan, for China. You know, like when a Japanese lawmaker will say, well, we're going to take the Senkakus and we're going to make it national territory now, because actually what happened is that way back when, you know, when Japan took the Senkakus at the time of the Sino-Japanese War, they gave them to a private individual, Japanese individual, you know, for research of herbs, that type of thing, development of the type of plant life, that type of thing, and examination of that. So that it's been with private ownership for how long? And just recently, within the past couple of years, Japan had a politician that said, we are not going to allow that. We are going to purchase the Senkakus, and this laid off a lot of protests in China. Car sales in China of Japanese cars went way down. You had situations with Chinese attacking Japanese cars, not similar than what happened in the 1980s with the United States, when the United States car industry went down and they would set up a Japanese car there and say, pay $1 and you can smash this car. Well, the same type of thing was happening in China with Japanese car makers. Their car sales went way down, and you saw people just going and attacking Japanese cars. So there is a lot of nationalism on both sides of this issue. And the interesting thing about it is that it doesn't, this nationalism doesn't recede, because the people who are in power, whether in China, whether in Japan, the appeal to, wow, these are our Senkaku Islands, you know, we've had these, you know, since the late 1890s, and we were formally recognized by the United States as having these, you know, and so these are ours. And what are the Chinese doing? You know, this is ours since for how long now? You know, for the past more than 100 years. What's China doing here? So that's Japan's perspective. And of course, you have Chinese perspective that we have been writing about these islands and passing by them and named them from the 1500s, from the 1400s. And so what is Japan doing now, just saying within the past 100 years they've had them? Yeah, that's because they took them during that war, and they were supposed to revert them back with the San Francisco Peace Treaty. And so you have two perspectives here. Two perspectives that really appeal to the people of the countries. And what are we getting now? Escalation. We're getting escalation. You have a recent situation where, and of course, what happened during the Nixon administration with Kissinger, and it's very interesting because Kissinger recently wrote a book, just a couple, 2-3 years ago, on China. Henry Kissinger made not one mention of the Senkakus. Not one mention. Now, you know that he was in deep negotiations and deeply figuring out what to do. You know, whether, does he revert them back to Taiwan? Does he, you know, Japan? Did they go with Japan with the Okinawa? This is back in 1971. Henry Kissinger was in the thick of figuring out all these things with President Nixon, in the thick of it. In his recent book, Henry Kissinger made no mention of the Senkakus. The last few pages of his book on China, he made an appeal to China to follow the path of peace. Now, different people have analyzed the moves of the Nixon administration at that time, and what one researcher has hypothesized, he says hypothesis, is that they were reverted to Japan with Okinawa in order to create a situation where Japan would continually be dependent, needing U.S. military support, making that U.S. would need to continually maintain a presence there, which in a sense is what the U.S. wanted to do in the aftermath of 40 years earlier, having World War II and Pearl Harbor bombed, that type of thing. So one researcher has hypothesized that the reason why the United States reverted the Senkakus to Japan was to create a kind of a friction there that the U.S. would always be in the thick of the situation, which the U.S. is. As we saw just recently, a U.S. warship and a Chinese warship were within not very close to each other, trying to figure out what to do. Also recently, in response to China declaring a military zone, and let's see, the U.S. has sent B-52 bombers over the Senkakus. So this is really an escalation, and the U.S. is in the thick. Now, let me just go to an article here. And so we'll just go to an article. I'll just take a few clicks here. Okay, here we go, from Peter Navarro. From Sarajevo to the Senkakus, the road to World War II. Okay, and you can come back to me now. I'll just show that, and you can come back to it. Here we go. Thank you very much. Okay, so there's an article by Peter Navarro, and there's really different schools of thoughts. Of course, you have two positions. You have essentially the Chinese position and the Japanese position. And you really have people on both sides of it. Now, I have a background in psychology and counseling, and we would take classes in forensic counseling. And there's something that we would call hired people, hired psychologists. You would have a situation in a courtroom, in forensic psychology, that's trying to figure out, law and justice type of issues. You have a situation in a courtroom where two different psychologists are arguing two different sides of a case. And of course, this psychologist was hired by the defense, and this psychologist was hired by the prosecutor. And so you have that type of situation here too. You have some people in our American arenas, whether they be journalists, whether they be politicians, that are deeply invested, for example, in the Japanese side of issues, that say, oh, China is just a big bully and they're causing problems. There'll always be evil, evil empire, Darth Vader, that type of thing. Okay, I'll just have to say that first article that we showed there is really from that perspective that, oh, Chinese, in the propaganda wars, it's propaganda. Oh, China has no stance and it's just China bullying and that type of thing. So we have that situation, and that's the reality of it. There will always be two sides of an issue, and people that are deeply invested in, the Japanese side, China's just terrible. You have people completely invested in the Chinese side of the issue, saying that Japan did this wrong, and it should have been reverted back to China, and it's been the Chinese in history, and Japan's just wrong about this issue. And so you really have two sides here, and it's a propaganda war. It really is a lot of propaganda trying to win over U.S. opinion, trying to win over politicians' opinion, trying to win over the White House or the administration or Congress's opinion. I'll have to say that first article that we showed talked about China being a bully. And so we already know that that's really from the Japanese perspective, that, wow, this should be Japan's from the late 1890s, and there should be no dispute. And actually, that is the official position from Japan. There is no dispute. These are Japan's. China doesn't dispute that. That is the official position of Japan, and the United States hasn't argued that there is no dispute. But actually, let's just go look at the first page of the second article now. And all you have to do is just show the page enough to be seen, and then we can revert back to it. So the second article here, Chinese officers told Japan about expanded air defense zone in 2010. Okay, and that's good enough for that. That's an article there. And so that article talks about Chinese officers talking to Japan officers, and actually there being a discussion of these types of issues in the dispute. So it's really interesting. This happens a lot of times in politics from the outset, towards the public. There is no dispute in this issue. It's like that, but then behind the scenes, there is something happening. Yes, there really is a dispute, and people really are trying to figure out what's happening here. It's a difficult situation, and if we could just go back to the first article and show that just for a moment, the first article. There we go. From Sarajevo to the Senkaku is the road to World War III. Okay, that's good enough there. Okay, thank you. Okay, so, but one thing very real, this can escalate. Because, again, from the outset, you have, people really invested and politicians being elected with a really nationalistic agenda or carrying the nationalistic agenda of China and saying, wow, we need to forge ahead with our perspective. This is ours. This is Japan's. No, this is China's. So you really have escalation here, and with the U.S. coming in on the side of Japan and bringing U.S. warplanes. So now what happens is you have an escalation that can result really in a U.S. and Japan-China conflict, that type of thing. And how can this happen? I mean, it's almost like a mistake can happen when a life is lost or something like that through someone's mistake, through someone not trying to cross the line but being crossed, or through hot-headedness, whatever situation. When you have warships and planes and soldiers all congregating in the same area with different interests, a mistake can happen. And if, we know this happened recently, within the past year or so, there was a situation where Filipino Navy personnel or Coast Guard, they shot and they killed some people from a country, and it just ruined relations just for a short time, okay? And if this situation happened at the Senkakus, we know that if something happened and someone died or some ship got sank or some plane got shot down, there would be calls from both sides that, we were justified in doing this. We need to retaliate. It's just a situation of retaliation. Now, why is this important here in Hawaii? Hawaii is the closest shore to the Senkaku Islands. The Senkakus, are just off of they're just there in the area of Okinawa and Taiwan, just in that area. Of course, Hawaii is the closest shore. Any warships, that type of thing, that go there would either be going from Guam or Okinawa or Hawaii in the end. We are the closest U.S. shore. Of course, the Okinawa just made it so that the U.S. base could still be there at a different place in Okinawa, but we are the closest U.S. shore to the Senkakus, to China, Japan. And this deeply affects us in many ways. As we know, from recently, just looking at tourism, who are the tourists that spend the most money per person here in Hawaii? The Chinese. The Chinese tourists spend the most money per person here in Hawaii. And of course, we know that, we have, there's deep Japanese American roots here. Senator Noy, he just passed away a year, not long ago. And we have a whole generation of Japanese Americans that were in the 100th or the 442nd and helped the U.S. in many ways, in a steep history, a deep history, from World War II, that type of thing, to being part of the process of Hawaii becoming a state, and so we have a culture that has so many aspects that from people from plantations coming from working here, the Japanese culture here, it's very present and very much a huge part of Hawaii. And then we have the Japanese tourists that come here. And of course, that is a huge thing. So we have multi-dimensions here. And of course, we have our Chinatown there. We have our huge Chinese New Year celebrations. So we have a culture here that has so many aspects of what it's like to be here in Hawaii. The aloha spirit, peace, peace, that type of thing. And again, just show the first article just for a moment there. That first article, okay, there we go. That's good, thank you. Okay. That first article really is spoken from a one-dimensional perspective. That one-dimensional perspective is Chinese are the bullies, they're doing something wrong, and if they do something wrong, if they cross the line, whoa, they're going to cause a lot of problems. China has a problem. That's one-dimensional. There's one-dimensionalness from the other side too. I mean, if you could read, in the Chinese newspapers, oh, Japan did this again, Japan did this again, Japan did this again. It's like that. It's like that. What's required to de-escalate these situations is the type of multi-dimensional thinking that we have here in Hawaii. We have the East-West Center, that Senator Inouye, Daniel Inouye, was so integral in forming, that is a vehicle of understanding. Here in Hawaii, we have so many wonderful friendship programs that send students, whether they be college or they be high school students, to Japan and study Japanese language. We have one of the premier programs where kids come from all over the country to study Chinese language here. We have an understanding of so many different aspects, of so many different issues. And what really is required in this type of situation is a place where this one-dimensional thinking can be de-escalated. Now, that's not to say that we don't have military preparedness. Of course, we're proud of our military, we support our military, and we want to have a very strong military, but that doesn't mean we want to use our military in such a manner where bad things happen. We want to have it. We want to support our soldiers. We want to support our sailors, our Marines, our Air Force. We want to support them fully. But there is a diplomatic route that would make it so that no military people, whether on the Chinese side, the Japanese side, the U.S. side, need to be sacrificed over something that could have been accomplished through diplomacy. Now, right now, and for the past how long, the U.S. perspective has been, what's going on here? Oh, something's going on. Let's send someone here. Let's react to this situation. Let's react to this. It's been very reactionary. Oh, what's happening? Oh, China's causing problems. Oh, what's happening here? What's happening here? It's extremely reactionary. Hawaii, though, Hawaii is invested in tourists from China, in tourists from Japan. It's a huge part of our culture. Go to Waikiki. You look at the ups and downs of the retailers there and all the workers that are supported through the tourists there, and not just Waikiki, different parts, Maui, Kauai, all the different, the Big Island. We really have an industry here that's dependent on the aloha spirit, bringing people over. This situation really requires that there be proactive diplomacy, proactive. And really it should initiate from Hawaii. It really should, because we have an understanding, more so than the rest of the United States. We have an understanding of all these different cultural aspects. China, Japan, the situation that happened in Pearl Harbor years ago. We have recent immigrants from China. We have all the tourists coming from Japan. We have a dialogue continually happening here. In fact, Senator Inouye's widow, she was very integral in some of the business connections with Japan. We truly, and the East-West Institute, the type of Chinese studies programs, it's so rich and deep. It really becomes to the point that if there be a peace process that happen that can resolve this issue, it really is upon the impetus that Hawaii needs to take a step, because Hawaii is the most invested here. Hawaii would be the most affected here. And Hawaii is the place where peace can originate from the East-West Center, from the understanding that our political leaders, our Congress people know of this situation. It really takes making a stand and saying, look, the rest of the United States, look, the rest of Congress, look, the White House. Okay, we are Hawaii. We understand situations deeply from multidimensional perspectives, not, oh, they're bad, they're bad. I mean, that's what happened when I was working at the Westin Hotel as a youth. There was an old World War II soldier, and in Seattle, he would be making fun of one of my coworkers who was of Japanese descent, because that old war veteran just was completely one-dimensional. He couldn't see different aspects. And that's a problem that we run into sometimes from the mainland. This type of situation requires multidimensional thinking, where the root of problems can be looked at, the root of a peace process can be looked at, and a plan for communication, opening up avenues of communication, and looking at a peace process can occur. You know, it's interesting. I talk about what happened at during the Nixon-Kissinger administration. At the same time, you know, it was ping-pong diplomacy with the Nixon-Kissinger administration that started that. You know, table tennis, it's interesting. China plays it, Japan plays it, all those ping-pong players know each other. It's a cool thing, you know. It wouldn't be a bad thing to have some ping-pong diplomacy over the Senkakus, starting here in Hawaii, actually. But one thing for definite, Hawaii has responsibility in this process to start the inception of a peace process that can be something that brings peace for our future generations here in Hawaii, future generations in Japan, future generations in China, and for this area, the Pacific, for the world, our country. Thank you very much. My name is John Roco. Take care. Have a good one.